Hey everyone, just a little bit of a PSA before we start the video. Firstly, I'd like to give a big thank you to my Nightmare Army for sticking by me through my very unorganized upload schedule. And secondly, if you would like to support the Nightmare Nation even further, I recently just made a Patreon account, and I would like to thank Rear Joint for being my first patron. So if you guys want to support the growing Nightmare Nation even further, the link is in the description below. Overall, guys, thank you again for watching, and enjoy the video. So, this happened a year ago, and I'm still pretty shaken by this whole event. I thought I'd tell my story. I live in the UK, and in autumn, it gets dark at around 4 p.m. There was a school autumn break that week, so all the kids were at home. So that means my girlfriend's brother was home too. I'd been with her for a year at that point, so her family knew me pretty well, and her brother enjoyed my company. She'd recently been pretty stressed out. Her parents were going up across the country for the day, so she had to look after her brother, but I thought that I'd give her a day to herself so she can just cool off. I asked her parents if I could look after their son for the day instead, and they agreed. So I came around at 8 a.m. and they let me in before they set off. My girlfriend's brother woke up about an hour later, and she followed shortly afterwards. We went out for breakfast at a local cafe together and went back to her house when we were done, and once I dropped her off, I took her brother to the park. We got there at about 2 p.m. and the place was pretty packed. Eventually the sun started going down and the place was completely empty by 4 p.m. I texted my girlfriend and told her we'd be home in a bit, and she said okay. I'm gonna be honest, I completely lost track of time. Me and her brother were having fun being the only two in the park. Me and her brother were standing on top of this really tall climbing frame with a slide on it. It was almost pitch black at this point, so I was using my phone as a flashlight. A notification popped up on my screen, and it was my girlfriend asking where we were. I responded, "Oops, coming home now," and told her brother we had to go. He sighed and asked if we can go down the slide, and I said yes. Before I went down, I knew what the park looked like. There were streetlights all around it, benches everywhere, some trees, and places for kids to play. When I came out of the slide, there was something weird. A man had appeared out of nowhere, and was stood beneath one of the streetlights. He had a trench coat on and a beanie hat. I immediately got my girlfriend's brother behind me and called out to the man with a friendly, "Hi there." I got a response. He started groaning. I noticed he was swaying back and forth in the light, and he had his mouth open, drooling with a blank look in his eye. This man made me feel really fucking uneasy. I picked little bro up and kept checking on this guy the entire time. There was an exit to my left that led to the path back home, so I left out that way and kept checking behind me every few seconds. The guy still stood there. The path where the guy was standing merges with a big main path if you walk out through some bushes, and so does the one I walked through. I was walking down the path for about 2 minutes, practically checking behind me, and I thought I was in the clear. I wasn't. I was on a straight stretch of path with lots of street lights when I saw him again. He was standing beneath one, looking up at it, and he was playing with something in his hands. I looked closer and realized it was a fucking knife. I kept walking and walking, checking behind me consistently. My girlfriend's little brother was so scared he had his head tucked into my chest. I noticed that the guy seemed to be moving to new streetlights whenever I turned around. Initially, I thought it was my eyes playing tricks on me, but I started counting them and realized 2 streetlights behind him had definitely turned into 5. I could faintly hear the groaning noise, and he was occasionally moaning as well. I picked up the pace a bit and turned a corner, getting into the last stretch of the street before I got to my girlfriend's house. That was when I heard him behind the row of bushes. That moaning noise sounded angry, and I heard his heavy footsteps bounding down the path. The man was fucking running. I immediately broke into a sprint and didn't stop until I turned an alleyway at the front of the street and got behind my girlfriend's house. There's a big bush there, so I crouched down behind that and spammed her phone with messages to open the back gate. I hugged her brother close until she opened it for us and got us in quickly. It felt like years. I went to the front of the house and confirmed that I had managed to shake him. He was now in the street, circling where I'd been, outside of the alleyway, just moments ago. He was still moaning. He had that knife in his hand still. He started kicking people's bins over. I called the police immediately, but he was gone by the time they arrived, and as far as I know, they never found him. There was a similar incident near the area a few months ago. I saw in a local Facebook group, but I don't think anything came of that either. Her parents thanked me for keeping their son safe and didn't hold any ill will against me for the situation. He went back to normal pretty much the day afterwards, but he still has nightmares about the event. When my country isn't in lockdown, I'm still allowed to look after him with my girlfriend, funnily enough. But we haven't been to that park ever since, and I still check over my shoulder and break into a cold sweat every time I'm alone in the street. When I was in grade school, my family lived in a house that sat directly across from the school I attended. However, there was about a half a mile of a wooded area between them. I was allowed to walk to and from school because it was so straightforward. My mother informed me that she and her siblings walked through the woods to school when they were younger, so it felt like a natural and safe thing for her. I loved the excitement of being able to walk to school all on my own, and I felt pretty at home in the woods as I had been raised around them. The walk was pretty direct, with very little issues, aside from a small but wide creek that I had to cross. The creek itself was no problem. It was the fact that on each side there was a steep bank that had to be scaled. It wasn't too terrible unless it had been raining. It had rained that day before, so my steps, which were normally loud, were fairly silent. This might have saved my life, at least saved me from something terrible. When I reached the creek, I was in my own little world. I was thinking about a science project we had to do at school, and whether or not I was fully prepared for my part in it. I was doing the supernova section and wasn't feeling very ready to make a speech in front of everyone explaining it. I reached the creek and dropped down the first bank with a slightly wet thud. I crossed over the water and began looking for something to grab a hold of to pull myself up with. There were usually roots sticking out to use. Before I could climb up the other side, I heard a noise, like people talking. I stopped and waited to see if I heard it again. I did. I heard a couple of boys talking, getting closer to me. I smashed myself up against the bank and listened for a minute. I don't know why, but something just told me to stay away, that something was wrong. The boys came so close, all the way to the edge of the creek bank, but they didn't jump down. If they had, they would have seen me in a flash. As luck would have it, there was an overhang that I was able to hide under. I listened as the boys talked. Yeah, she comes through here all the time. Should be coming around in just a minute. My heart sank. I was the only person that walked this trail to and from school, and they were in my direct path. That isn't to say that no one else was ever in the woods, but in all the time I used this trail, I had never seen another person. To get to the woods from my house, I had to cross the road and walk through a small flat area with trees, and from the school side, I had to walk through the school's football field. Anyone from either side could have seen me going in or out of the woods easily. I stood plastered to the wall of mud, waiting for them to catch me, but they walked around a little bit, smoked a couple of cigarettes, and started getting frustrated. Where the fuck is she, man? You said she would be here, so where is she? Maybe she isn't coming to school today. Anyway, we gotta go or we're gonna miss our bus. The high schoolers caught their bus to the high school at the elementary school. This told me two things. They were obviously in high school, so much older than me, and two, They had some seriously bad intentions towards me. I heard them leaving, but I didn't dare move. I waited a good 30 minutes or so before I darted out of the creek bed and toward home. I will never know exactly what those two boys had planned to do to me that day, and I'm not sure I want to. So, creepy high schoolers waiting in the woods for a little girl? Let's not meet. This is a story that my father has told me multiple times. My dad is a logger, specifically one who operates a tree saw, which is basically a giant machine that is capable of cutting down massive trees and cutting them to a specified length, which means he spends a lot of time alone in the deep forest. The way my dad's logging crew was set up is that he would be told where he was supposed to cut down trees, and he would go do that and be paid based on the amount of trees he cut, not on how long it took him. So my dad used to work 16 to 20 hours a day constantly to get done as quick as possible, and then the rest of the crew would come clean up the trees and ship them to the mill. He used to work around 50% of the time alone, and the rest of the time with another tree saw operator named Rainey. They would use radios to communicate back and forth when they were working together. Sorry for all the backstory, but this is the start to the story. My dad and Rainey were put on a new job site, and were about 10 days in, and everything was going as planned. But they were constantly hearing weird chitter-chatter over the radio that was such poor quality no words could be heard, and whatever radio channel they changed it to, it followed them. As they progressed through the job and went further up the mountain, the words from the radio slowly became more audible. Both of them agreed based on the small parts of the conversations. They could hear that something was wrong. They also started finding weird containers all over the place, and signs that people had been here. People should not have been here. This was a 2.5-hour drive up a mountain. They had to spend 3 weeks clearing out the road so their trucks and equipment could make it up. They came to the realization that they are in a very secluded area with people who shouldn't be there, and the worst part is that they aren't scheduled to leave for about another week. They would only leave to refuel the truck with gasoline for the machines. They would buy supplies and sleep in campers. One day, Rainey comes across a tent and calls my dad over. They investigate the tent and find one lone sleeping bag and a duffel bag. They investigate the duffel bag and find many pairs of children's underwear and things that appear to be a rape kit like rope, duct tape, sketched images of children being molested, and photographs of children that appear unaware they are being photographed. In the tent, they also find a small amount of food which includes canned goods and an apple, which proves the tent has been occupied recently because there was no mold on the apple. They are now on the mountain alone with which at best case scenario is just a really fucked up individual. Rainey instantly wants to get the fuck out of there, but my dad, being the hardest working person I've ever met, insists that they need to finish the job and get the fuck out of there. They decide that they will not talk over the radios, except in case of emergency, and see if they could hear something over the radio. They are now in close enough range of whoever has been talking over the radio to hear the conversations between the two men about collecting water and wood for the fire. Nothing abnormal, except for the fact that these guys don't fucking belong here and that the tent was undoubtedly theirs. At the end of the workday, my dad hears them on the radio talking about one of them collecting brush for a fire. My dad hops on the radio and attempts to communicate with them about what the fuck they are doing. I believe he said, "Who are you and what are you doing here?" After this, the conversation between the two men abruptly stops and they never pick up. That night, Rainey wakes my dad up and whispers for him to get his gun. Someone's outside. My dad has told me that the first thing he hears when he wakes up is the quiet shuffling of footsteps. My dad fumbles for his gun and finds it, but realizes that he doesn't fucking have it loaded and has little clue where his rounds are, and Rainey has nothing. and the thought of calling the police is absurd for multiple reasons. They hear a jingle at the doorknob, and it opens. The camper is far enough off the ground to where you had to jump in, and there's no ladder or footstool. It just stays open, and neither my dad nor Rainey move. They hear scratching right outside the door, though. After 4 minutes of scratching, my dad can no longer take it and nods at Rainey. He gets up quietly and walks towards the camper door, and the second he reaches it, he is met with intense pain across his right eye all the way to his left cheek. He has been cut and falls out of the camper, hitting the ground hard. A man with a knife gets on top of him, and he is soon being kicked in the top of the head by a man behind him. Rainey leaps out of the trailer and manages to get the man off my dad, and my dad gets up and realizes that the second man without the knife is running away, and the man with the knife is scrambling away from Rainey and starts running alongside his accomplice. My dad and Rainey get into the truck and drive to the nearest hospital to treat my dad's cuts, and later report the events to the police. They both quit their jobs, and 2 weeks later, as the rest of the logging crew was finishing up the job, one of them was found, gagged, bound, raped, murdered, and thrown into a ditch. No one has ever been convicted of these crimes. To this day, my dad can hardly see out of his right eye, and the pupil is disfigured and looks more like a cat's eye than a human's. He suffers PTSD from these events and hasn't slept a good night of sleep since. This happened to me when I was about 12 or 13 years old, so about 15 years ago, and I am a female. The town that I live in has developed a lot since this story, but when this happened, there were a lot of factories spread out with lots of land in between them. There was a Walmart being built in the area, but it had barely started construction. There was a main highway that ran through there, but my mom didn't like taking it as much, as traffic would get bad most of the time. The side streets we would take were desolate and not much light. There was also little to no cars taking these streets. I can't remember where we were coming from that night, but in the car that night was my mom, my brother, and me. My mom is obviously driving. I'm in the passenger seat and my brother is sitting behind me. My mom is the sweetest person ever, but is very adamant that she will never stop to help somebody on the side of the road or pick somebody up, especially when her kids were in the car. She does, however, make sure she calls the police so that they can help. It was around 9 p.m. and we were going home when my mom and I spot someone on the side of the road by the passenger side with their hood up. Nothing out of the ordinary as my mom slows down a little, since it is dark outside and doesn't want to harm anybody that might be fixing their car. As soon as we are close to the car, this guy steps out from around the hood of the car towards the street and is waving us down. I don't remember much of a description because I wasn't paying too much attention. Plus, I could barely see the man. But I do remember feeling bad we weren't at least going to stop to see what he needed. The man at this point is in the middle of the road waving his hands, but as we come upon the car, we don't see anybody else in the car. So my mom swerves around him and tells my brother to find her phone in her purse that was on the floor, between the front and back seats. I look at my mom as she looks in her rearview mirror, and her face goes white and her eyes get wide. My mom slams her foot on the accelerator. This is highly unusual for my mom as she's really good at going the speed limit. At this point, I knew something is wrong. My mom's voice goes high, and in a panicked voice is asking my brother where is her phone. I'm yelling at her, what is going on? All this chaos is freaking my brother out, and with him being so little is crying and can't find the phone. My mom keeps her eyes on the road, but keeps glancing up continuously at her rearview mirror, and finally answers, "He's following us!" I'm not exactly sure what she is talking about, but know that this isn't a good situation. My mom is speeding towards the highway, and thank goodness there is no traffic. I look in the back window and see somebody passing cars trying to keep up with my mom. I ask her where she is going, and she told me she's heading to the police station. As we are getting close, my mom tells me to jump out of the car as soon as she stops the car, and grab my brother from the back seat while she runs around the car to meet us. My mom stops right in front of the police station and doesn't even wait for the car to fully come to a stop before she puts the car in park. I open my car door as fast as I can and grab my brother, who has quickly opened his door. I take off in a full sprint with my brother in one hand and my mom on the other hand. Once we finally talked to a police officer is when I finally understood the full extent of what happened. My mom told the police officer that once we had passed the guy with the broken down car, he quickly ran to the hood of his car and slammed it. He then got into his car and sped after us. That was when my mom knew this guy had horrible intentions for us. She said he kept trying to speed up to get on the side of us, but she was able to speed up to avoid that. Once my mom turned toward the police station, she said the guy had stopped following her. She gave the best description of the guy and his car, but because everything happened so fast, she didn't get a license plate number. I'm pretty sure the police never found him. I'm also not sure what the guy had planned for us if we had actually stopped to help, but I know it was nothing good. To the guy that faked his car being broken down on an empty street, let's not ever meet again. It was the summer right after I graduated from high school. A good friend and I decided to try our hand at camping. We grew up in the greater Los Angeles area, so our knowledge of the great outdoors was nothing beyond the couple of years we had in Cub Scouts of America when we were in elementary school. In other words, we had absolutely no idea what we were doing. We packed a tent, a couple of sleeping bags, supplies, and headed off in his car. Note well that I grew up in the 80s, so this is a time before the wide prevalence of cell phones and the existence of other portable digital devices. We drove north on the 395 for about 6 hours, and then headed westward into the mountains in the area of the Inyo Canyon. First mistake, we didn't plan on which place to camp, we played it by ear. Like fools. Second mistake, we left in mid-afternoon. It was pitch black darkness when we arrived in the general area. We had driven off the main road onto a dirt road in order to find a spot to camp. When we finally decided to pull over and set up camp, it was around 11 p.m. and we were exhausted and famished. Any place was a good spot to camp for us, given our only reason to do so at that point was our hunger and exhaustion. Third mistake, we didn't bring flashlights, we only had lighters for our cigarettes. We tried to set up the tent using our lighters and the headlights of the car, which was parked about 10 to 15 feet away. The wind was blowing, so the lighter constantly went out after a few seconds, either directly because of the wind or indirectly because the wind would push the flame into our thumb. Clearly, we were being complete idiots. We finished setting up the tent, but at that point, I was too tired to eat. My friend managed to make some instant ramen. We smoked a cigarette in the car, then crashed out in the tent. We awoke to a very cold morning. It must have been around 5:30 a.m. Immediately upon exiting the tent, we realized that we were camped at the entrance of a hiking trail. There were at least 2 no camping signs in visible distance from us. We dismantled the tent, cleaned up, and cleared out. That morning, we ended up buying some cheap flashlights and a nice hot meal in a very small town. It wasn't really a town, but more like a few storefronts and shops on a main road, about the length of an average city block. We went into some office, though I don't recall exactly what it was. It might have been a park ranger station or the office headquarters for a campground. In any case, we found and reserved a site for the night. The campground was basically like a large circle with campsites all along its outer circumference, with each campsite being about 50 yards from its neighbor. In the middle of the circle was a common bathroom and shower. We circled around it once, and I think we saw one family that was all set up with a tent and a camper. We found our spot and set up camp. which was quite far from them. That night was when we had a creepy encounter. My friend and I were laying in the tent, shining our flashlights upwards and chatting. Our new flashlights eventually gave out, yes, broken. Our fire pit was about 6 feet from the opening of our tent, and it was just glowing ember. We probably should have completely put it out, and we probably shouldn't have had the tent so close. In any case, there we were, chatting away and having a good time. My friend began to be distracted with his foot. After the third or fourth time, he got up to check his foot. I asked him what was wrong. He told me that something is tapping his foot from the outside of the tent. His foot was against the side of the tent, so from the outside you would have been able to see a bulge in the tent side where his foot was. It was as if pebbles were being thrown at his foot through the tent. There it is again! What the hell? Each time it happened, there was a sound like pebbles or a light tap. We sort of laughed it off, assuming that it was a twig or grass moving in the wind, or perhaps a loose strap on the outside of the tent. I don't recall exactly how it happened at first, but I do remember we suddenly became silent at the same time. A sound came to be audible to both of us. Footsteps slowly moving towards our tent. We wondered if it was a bear or other non-human animal, but it seemed distinctly bipedal. They were very slow and measured, like a step every 2 seconds. I finally said in a whisper, "Someone's coming." My friend didn't move. His face had an expression of fear. At some point, my friend bolted up and said, "Fuck this." He grabbed his pipe, stuffed it full of pot, and took the biggest, deepest drags I've ever seen a person take. About a minute or two later, he was out. Drugs aren't my thing, so I was alone in the tent as far as conscious bodies are concerned. I was sitting up at this point, and I had taken out the only weapon I had, a Swiss Army pocket knife. I took out the big and small blades, as well as an ice pick in the middle, and held it like some ridiculous melee weapon. I could see the glowing embers in the fire pit through the sheer nylon material of our tent, and I was able to roughly but barely discern some of the rocks around it. I watched and listened intently. The footsteps came closer, and at the same slow pace with each step, I could hear the dirt and rocks underfoot crunching and grinding. At some point, it was clear to me that whoever it was standing between the tent and the fire pit. For my fuzzy line of sight to the burning embers through the nylon tent became obscured by something outside the tent. The footsteps stopped right at the front of the tent, about 6 to 8 inches, no more than from the entrance to the tent. It was silent for about 1 minute, and then I heard a click. At exactly the same time, I clearly saw through the nylon tent wall a flashlight turn on. I was able to see not just the flashlight, but the outline of the hand holding it. The flashlight was shining on the zipper entrance into the tent, just inches from the zipper. Blood drained out of my head, and my palms instantly became dripping in sweat. I yelled, "Who's there?" There was some fear in my voice, but it was mostly aggressive in tone. Whoever it was, the person immediately turned off their flashlight. I didn't move, but neither did they. The person just stood there, inches from the tent's only entrance. My friend is out, totally unaware of what's going on. Nevertheless, I pretended that he was still awake and whispered just loud enough to be audible to our visitor. "Yes, loaded. There's one in the chamber." As if my friend was awake and asked me about our gun. Fourth mistake. We didn't have a gun or any real weapon for self-defense. It felt like an eternity, but after sitting still for at least 10 minutes, I heard feet slowly turning in the dirt, then slowly walking away from the tent. I stayed up the whole night, and it wasn't until the light of dawn came through the tent that I crashed out. The heat inside the tent woke us up, and it was near noon by this point. We went outside to inspect the site, but found nothing missing. However, we did find boot prints leading away from our campsite and outside the campground. That was the last time I camped in a tent. Back when I was 18 years old, I started working at a gas station. This was my first job. Near the end of my first shift, I was cleaning the hot dog rollers, and a man walked in. He was rough looking, not in a bad way, but like he had been working outside all day. As soon as I set eyes on him, I got this gut feeling that I needed to stay away from him. Since I wasn't the one at the register, there was no reason for him to talk to me. However, the moment he saw me, he walked over and asked if I was new. I said yes, and he told me I was doing a good job and went on his way to check out. I noticed that he had a Jamaican accent, which was weird to hear since I lived in Michigan. Honestly, at that point, I thought that my gut was wrong about him, and that I probably felt that way because I have bad social anxiety and had reached my limit of human interaction for the day. I was right the first time. During my next shift, he once again came in, and again, I was cleaning. He came over to me, and I still got that bad feeling in my gut. He asked me how my day was, and I told him that it was okay. He then looked at my hand. I was wearing my high school class ring, and I had put it on my left hand ring finger because I didn't want to scruff it up while cleaning with my right hand. He asked if I was married, and I said no and told him it was my class ring. He then asked if I was dating, and I lied and said yes. He started asking me questions about my boyfriend, like how old was he, did I want to marry him, and if we were in a physical relationship. I told him I wasn't comfortable with answering that, and he got mad but dropped the conversation. He would continue to ask me questions about my love life every time he would come in. After about a month and a half of this, I noticed that he would come in every day that I was working. This was weird because the days and hours that I worked changed from week to week. I asked my coworkers if he came in when I wasn't here, and all of them said no. I also asked if any of them had told him what shifts I had been working, but again, they said no. This honestly freaked me out, and I would start to have a panic attack every time that I would see his car pull in. One day, he tried to give me his phone number, and I politely told him that I wasn't interested in it. He got mad and was telling me that I needed to take it. My coworker, at this point, told him that he needed to leave. The next day, he came in and asked me on a date, and when I declined, he told me that I was going to regret it. He asked me several more times, and each time I said no. After a while of him asking, I told him that it was never going to happen, and that I had absolutely no interest in him, and I never would. This only made things worse. He told me that I didn't have a choice, and that he would be here when I got off work, and that I was going to go with him. When he left, I called my father and told him what happened, and asked if Mom and he could come pick me up at the end of my shift. He said yes. I didn't get off until midnight, and about 10 minutes before my dad walked in, he told me to act like I was going to my car as normal, but he was going to be in there. A few minutes after the guy pulled in and got out of his car, and I was just standing there. As my shift was over, I hurriedly walked to my car. He started approaching me, and I jumped into the passenger seat and slammed the door shut. When he got to my door, my dad rolled down the window and pointed his gun at him. The man ran off, and I thought that was the end of it since he didn't come back into my job the next few days. However, about a week later, I was at the store with my mom when I got the feeling that someone was following us, and sure enough, it was him. We got out of there as fast as we could, and from then on out, my mom and I were not allowed to leave without my dad. Everywhere I would go, he would show up, even when I went to my friend's house who lived about a half hour from me. We caught him driving by the house several times. My mother had also caught him following her several times, which freaked her out. We contacted the police and told them what was going on, but they said there wasn't enough evidence and that there was nothing they were able to do. To this day, I'm still mad at the police for not doing anything. He started coming back into my workplace, and I asked my boss to ban him from the store, but she said no. Later, I would find out that they were friends, and that is how he always knew when I was working. I also believe that she was the one to give him my phone number, because it was around this time that I started receiving strange messages about how I looked, about my parents, and other creepy things. I got to the point where I was so paranoid that I wouldn't leave my house without my father, and when he was at work I would carry a gun around with me. I had to have him drop me off and pick me up from work, and when I was at work every time I had seen a car that even somewhat looked like his, I would run and hide in the back room. Even my poor mother was paranoid and wouldn't go outside without someone with her. Finally, my father had enough and told me to quit my job and that he would help me pay the few bills that I had. Even after quitting my job, I was freaked out and decided to go stay with my aunt and uncle, who live about 6 hours away from me. When I got there, it was the first time in nearly 6 months that I was able to relax. It didn't last too long, though. One night, my uncle and I went to pick up pizza. Less than a minute after he walked in, the glass on my door was broken and hands were grabbing me. It was the Jamaican man and another guy. They got the door open and were pulling me out. I fought them as hard as I could. I got a few good hits on them, but it didn't do much good. Thankfully, my uncle came out. Both of them ran after my uncle announced who he was, but my uncle chased down the Jamaican man after I shouted which man he was. That day, he was arrested. I cried for hours straight from relief, anger, and stress later on. I found out that he was here illegally and was deported. It took about 2 years before I would go anywhere by myself. Honestly, it wasn't until I got my CLP that I was comfortable going places without someone with me. I still get panic attacks from time to time because of seeing a car like his, or if I feel like someone is watching me. So Jamaican man, if you're reading this, let's not meet again.